Jeffrey Mills, a history teacher from Casper, Wyoming, took his family on a camping trip to the Bridger-Teton National Forest. On the last day, he went for an early morning hike alone, and when he returned to camp, his family was gone. There was no trace of them, but their belongings were undisturbed. Authorities eventually ruled his family missing. In 1992, he returned to that forest. While there, he stumbled upon an empty, abandoned campsite. It looked exactly like his own family's setup, down to the torn corner of his daughter's favorite tent. Jeffrey claims he saw his family's setup and that whatever took them was waiting for him to return. This is Jeffrey's story. I'd planned it for months. My wife and 2 kids, Ryan, 10, and Maggie, 7, would get to see the stars without city lights, and maybe, if we were lucky, spot some wildlife out in the Bridger-Teton National Forest. They were excited. You'd have thought I promised them a trip to Disneyland, the way they were bouncing around, packing every piece of camping gear I told them we'd need. I was happy about it. I figured these few days would be good for all of us. We'd be cut off from work, school, and the noise. It was just a family thing. We drove up in the old Toyota pickup, loaded to the brim. After the long drive, we finally hit the dirt road that wound us deep into the forest, close to the point I'd mapped out. By mid-afternoon, we found a spot with a good view of the mountains and set up camp. I let the kids run around a bit while I started on the tent. My wife, Anne, was already unpacking snacks. Everything felt normal. Perfect, even. That first night, we sat around the fire, roasted marshmallows, and told stories. The kids laughed and made faces at each other, getting all sticky with the marshmallows. I remember thinking that maybe this was the way things were supposed to be. No phones, no worries, just us out there together. By the time the fire burned low, we were all beat, and I don't think it took us more than 10 minutes to fall asleep once we hit the sleeping bags. The second day, I woke up early and decided to go for a walk before everyone else woke up. I figured I could get the lay of the land, maybe see if there were any good spots to take the kids later. I left a quick note on the cooler, saying I'd be back in an hour or so. I was gone for maybe 45 minutes, just following the path along the trees and checking out the creek that ran not too far from our site. The fire was out, and the tent flap was open, which I thought was strange. Anne was usually a light sleeper, and she kept a close eye on the kids. They would have heard me leave, but maybe they were still groggy, or maybe they thought I'd just stepped away to get some water from the creek. But it was too quiet. No giggles, no movement, no sound of anyone rummaging through the cooler or whispering. "Anne?" I called. Nothing. My voice bounced off the trees and went quiet. I walked over to the tent, opened it fully, and peeked in. Empty. The blankets were rumpled, like they'd just gotten out, and Maggie's stuffed bear was tossed to the side. Everything looked untouched, like they'd just walked off. I called their names again, a little louder. "Anne, Ryan, Maggie." Silence. I felt my stomach tighten. Maybe they'd gone on a little walk without telling me. But the note was still there, propped on the cooler, and none of them had their hiking shoes on. Their boots were right by the tent. I took a deep breath and scanned the area, figuring they couldn't have gone far. I started off on the path I'd come from, figuring I'd catch up to them if they'd gone down toward the creek, but every few steps I found myself calling their names a little louder, hearing only the emptiness reply. The further I walked, the less sense it made. The ground was still soft from last night's rain, and there were no tracks leading down the path, only my own boot prints from earlier. I headed back to camp, walking faster now, my pulse quickening. I checked inside the truck, thinking maybe the kids had snuck in there to play, or maybe they'd fallen asleep, but it was empty too. My hands started to shake as I checked around the campsite again, trying to convince myself there was some reasonable explanation. Maybe they'd taken a shortcut through the trees or wandered off just a bit further. But as I scouted out each little section of our site, a creeping fear settled in that I didn't want to acknowledge. I made my way back to the creek, calling their names louder than before, straining to hear any response. But the forest was silent. Not just quiet, but dead, silent. No birds, no rustling in the bushes, nothing. I'd never been in a forest that still before. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. Panic was starting to get a grip on me, but I kept moving, shouting until my voice was hoarse. An hour went by, maybe 2. By that time, I knew I needed help. I got back to the truck, fumbled with the radio I'd brought along for emergencies, and called for assistance. It was the first time I'd ever had to use it. When the rangers arrived, they could tell I was shaken. I described everything as clearly as I could. The time I'd left, how everything looked normal, and how they were simply gone when I returned. The ranger, a man named Jeff, had this calm about him that I envied. He just nodded, taking it all in, then started giving orders to his team to search the area. They didn't waste any time. For the rest of the day and well into the night, I watched as the rangers fanned out with flashlights, dogs, and even a small helicopter overhead, combing through the forest. They found nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, nothing. Around midnight, Jeff came over to where I was sitting, my head in my hands, and told me they were suspending the search for the night, resuming it at first light. I couldn't sleep. I just sat by the fire, watching the shadows stretch long and thin across the empty tent, feeling like I was losing my mind. Every sound, every whisper of wind through the trees made me sit up and listen, hoping to hear my kids laughing or Anne calling my name. But all I heard was silence. The search went on for days. More teams joined, volunteers from nearby towns came out, and eventually even a few reporters showed up. I barely registered any of it. My mind was on a loop, going over every second from the morning they disappeared, trying to figure out what I missed, what I could have done differently. On the 5th day, the search team decided to pull back. They'd covered every inch of forest within a 50-mile radius. No trace at all, like they'd vanished into thin air. I felt empty, numb, like I was floating outside my body watching this nightmare play out from a distance. I went back to the city, back to the house, but it never felt right, like a shadow was hanging over everything. I'd sit at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chairs, listening for footsteps in the hall, or a giggle that would never come. I kept seeing flashes of that campsite, the fire pit, the tent, Maggie's stuffed bear lying forgotten on the ground. Every detail was burned into my mind. People tried to get me to move on, to accept that they were gone, but I couldn't. They didn't understand. My family didn't just disappear. Something happened to them out there, and I needed to know what. A year after the disappearance, I went back to the forest. I know how that sounds, like a desperate man clinging to the last threads of hope, but I had to. I felt this pull, this nagging feeling that something was still waiting for me back there, something unfinished. When I arrived at the campsite, it was like stepping back in time. Everything was exactly as I remembered. The old fire pit, the spot where we'd set up the tent, the clearing where we'd laughed and roasted marshmallows. All of it looked frozen in place, untouched by time or weather. And then I saw it. Right there, in the middle of the campsite, was Maggie's stuffed bear. I knew it couldn't be the same one. I'd taken it with me when I left that day, clinging to it like a lifeline. But here it was, lying in the dirt, worn and faded, just as I'd found it that morning when they disappeared. I picked it up, my hands shaking. My head felt light, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. It smelled like smoke, like the campfire from that night. The longer I held it, the stronger the feeling got, that they were close, somehow still out here, waiting. I started to walk, following some instinct I couldn't explain, deeper into the woods. Every step felt heavy, like I was wading through water, but I kept going, drawn by something I couldn't see. Hours passed, maybe even days. I lost track of time entirely. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, that I was on the verge of finding them. Eventually, I came to a clearing. In the middle was a small, abandoned campsite. It was old, worn down, like it had been left untouched for years. But as I looked closer, I realized it was identical to ours. The same tent, the same cooler, even the same little details like Ryan's hiking boots lying by the entrance. I stood there, frozen. This wasn't possible. I took a step closer, my heart pounding, and reached for the cooler. Inside, I found a single piece of paper. It was torn and faded, but I recognized my own handwriting. It was the note I'd left on the cooler that morning, the one that said I'd be back in an hour. I dropped the note, my mind racing, trying to piece together the impossible. This wasn't some trick, some hallucination. I was standing in the middle of my own campsite, but it was as if it had been left behind, forgotten for years, yet untouched. I heard a sound behind me, a faint whisper, like someone calling my name. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty trees and the silent forest stretching out in every direction. But the voice continued, soft and distant, just on the edge of hearing. I tried to follow it, stumbling through the trees, calling out to my family, my voice breaking with each word. But the voice never got closer. It was always just out of reach, leading me deeper and deeper into the forest. I don't know how long I wandered. Days, weeks, I lost all sense of time. I barely slept, barely ate, surviving on the scraps I'd brought with me. The whole time I could feel them close, like they were just beyond my reach, waiting for me to find them. Eventually the forest thinned out, and I found myself back on the road. The search team found me a few days later, barely alive, rambling about the voices, the campsite, and the stuffed bear. They took me to a hospital, fed me, and tried to get me to tell them what happened, but I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make them understand. Even now, years later, I don't know what happened to my family. The forest took them, swallowed them up, and left no trace. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I hear that faint whisper again, calling me back, pulling me toward the woods. Part of me wants to go, to see if I can find them, to finish what I started. But another part knows that if I go back, I might never return. So I stay here, haunted by the memory of that empty campsite, the smell of the smoke, and the feel of Maggie's bear in my hands. They're still out there, somewhere, and whatever took them is waiting for me too. When I'm on the brink and can't take it any longer, I'll let the forest take me too.